that Grig was. You know, he made up all these weird little random things to do that he just added to the character. He mapped this whole thing out, which I thought was kind of a cool way of creating an alien, you know.
Back in the 1980s, kids lined up at arcades dreaming that a high score might change their lives. The Last Starfighter turned that fantasy into cinema, but its own story was stranger than fiction.
He was wearing like an inch thick of rubber.
Yeah.
And so he had to figure out a way, which I think is what you're talking about, of how to make this character alive.
From battles over technology to behind-the-scenes chaos, nearly every frame carries a secret. This isn't just the making of a movie. It's the untold saga of how a cult classic was born. The arcade spark. In the early 80s, arcades were the center of the universe for a lot of kids. Bright screens, electronic sound effects, and the constant rush of competition filled the air. Quarters were stacked on the machines as players waited for their turn, and beating a high score could make you a legend in your neighborhood. Jonathan R. Betuel, the writer behind The Last Starfighter, spent time watching that culture unfold. He saw how seriously players treated the games. They leaned in close, eyes fixed, and every move full of tension. It looked less like kids wasting time and more like soldiers training for battle. And that image stayed with him. From that came a question that changed everything. What if a video game was secretly a test? What if playing wasn't just for fun, but a way to find someone capable of doing something extraordinary? That single thought became the foundation of the story. Betuel built his main character, Alex Rogan, around that idea. Alex lived in a small trailer park and spent his free time chasing high scores on a machine sitting right outside his home. The game became more than a distraction and metamorphosed into the gateway to a bigger world. By mastering it, Alex earned his shot to do something no one in his town could even dream about. And that was flying into space and defending the galaxy. The setup connected with audiences because it was simple. It was unlike some of the other movie plots that had secret bloodlines and prophecies. It was just all about skill, focus, and determination. Anyone who had ever held a joystick could imagine themselves in Alex's place. That made the story personal in a way that hit home for an entire generation of kids. The timing of the movie's release added to the impact. Video games were exploding across the country, and most adults thought they were pointless. Instead, this movie suggested the opposite. It told young players that their hours at the arcade could mean something, that all that practice might prepare them for a challenge beyond their wildest dreams. But drawing inspiration from the arcade is not the only weird thing about The Last Starfighter. From suburbia to trailer park. Most sci-fi movies throw their heroes into big, shiny worlds right away. But The Last Starfighter did the opposite. Alex Rogan lived in a trailer park. Not a futuristic city or a space station, but a cluster of trailers, dusty roads, and neighbors who always seemed to need something fixed. It was about as ordinary as a setting could get, which is what makes it so unusual for a film that ends up in the middle of a galactic battle. The choice was deliberate, though, because Jonathan R. Betuel, the writer, wanted Alex to be the kind of kid anyone could relate to. His life wasn't glamorous. He wasn't surrounded by high-tech gadgets or big opportunities. He was just trying to escape a place that felt small, with dreams that didn't seem possible. The arcade game sitting in the middle of that trailer park became his only window to something bigger. That little detail is one of the many reasons why the movie stood out. The Starfighter machine feels almost out of place there, glowing in the middle of all that everyday life. And when Alex breaks the high score, the whole community notices. The neighbors gather, cheer, and react like something historic just happened. For a place that rarely saw excitement, that exact moment became larger than life. The trailer park setting also gave the story heart. Alex wasn't fighting to leave behind a palace or a city filled with riches. He was fighting to break out of a world that felt stuck. That frustration made his eventual journey into space hit harder. Audiences connected with him because so many people knew what it was like to feel trapped in a place that seemed to hold them back. It's funny to think about how this small detail affected the whole movie. By starting the story in such an ordinary setting, the leap into starships and alien wars felt even stranger and more exciting. The director was Michael Myers. Before The Last Starfighter ever blasted off into space, its director had already carved his name into horror history, literally. Nick Castle was the man wearing the mask in John Carpenter's Halloween. Every time Michael Myers stalked across the screen in silence, that was Castle moving with deliberate, eerie calm. What makes this so bizarre is how different the two movies are. One is a low-budget slasher about a faceless killer. The other is a colorful, computer-driven space fantasy. You couldn't pick two genres further apart, and yet Castle bridged them. It's almost like Hollywood dared him to prove he could go from stabbing teenagers to launching starships. Castle wasn't really an actor at all. He only played Michael Myers because he and Carpenter were college friends, and the production needed someone tall, cheap, and available. But Castle added tiny touches, such as the infamous head tilt and the stiff movements that made Myers terrifying. Then, only a few years later, he switched gears completely and sat in the director's chair for The Last Starfighter. You can actually feel some of his horror instincts tucked into the movie. Remember when Alex's beta unit is lying in bed, twitching under the sheets, and his little brother freaks out? That scene plays almost like it wandered out of a horror film. And Zur, the villain with his glowing scepter, has the flair of a guy who knows how to make evil unsettling. So, in a strange way, The Last Starfighter owes part of its edge to Michael Myers. The same guy who once terrified audiences with a kitchen knife ended up giving kids a cult sci-fi classic that made them dream about arcade games turning into galactic battles. Talk about career whiplash. Almost starred Michael J. Fox. Did you know that Alex Rogan could have been played by Michael J. Fox? Yes, the same Michael J. Fox who later became a global star with Back to the Future. During the early 80s, Fox was still trying to break through, and casting directors for The Last Starfighter actually considered him for the lead role. It's wild to think about how different the movie might have felt. Fox had a natural charm and a quick wit that made him perfect for characters who were likable underdogs. He would have brought that same energy to Alex Rogan. In fact, his style might have made the film even more comedic than it ended up being. But, in the end, the role went to Lance Guest. And looking back, that was a surprising but smart choice. Guest wasn't a huge name, which made him believable as an ordinary kid. Viewers didn't see a celebrity. All they saw was Alex. That helped sell the idea that he could be a regular person from a trailer park suddenly pulled into something enormous. Still, imagining Fox in that cockpit is a fun what-if. He was almost destined to play a character who stumbled into adventure, so it's easy to picture him sliding right into Alex's shoes. But if Fox had taken the part, there's a chance he wouldn't have been available when Back to the Future came around. And without that role, the entire course of his career might have been different. This little casting twist shows how much of Hollywood comes down to timing. Fox missed out on The Last Starfighter, but soon after, he landed the role of Marty McFly and became one of the biggest stars of the decade. Meanwhile, Lance Guest got his moment as Alex Rogan, cementing himself as the face of a cult sci-fi classic. So, while Michael J. Fox never got to sit in the Gunstar or fire off those famous death blossoms, the fact that he was even in the running makes the story of The Last Starfighter even weirder. It's one of those behind-the-scenes details that makes you wonder how different both the movie and Fox's career could have been with one small decision. And speaking of what could have been, did you know that someone else almost beat Nick Castle for the role of director? James Cameron almost directed. Before Nick Castle stepped in to direct the movie, there was another name floating around. Not just any name, but James Cameron, who would later give the world Aliens, Terminator 2, and Titanic. For a brief moment in the early 80s, he was actually being looked at for this movie. The thought of Cameron behind the camera is enough to make sci-fi fans' heads spin. He was already building a reputation for pushing boundaries with technology and tension. Imagine The Last Starfighter, but darker, grittier, and filled with that relentless energy Cameron became famous for. Instead of a fairy tale feel, it might have turned into something closer to a survival epic in space. So why didn't it happen? Well, it all boils down to timing. Cameron had just come off the Terminator, and his career was about to explode. Schedules didn't match up, and the project slipped away from him. That's when Nick Castle, a totally different kind of filmmaker, was brought in. Castle had a lighter touch and leaned into the hopeful, almost storybook vibe. He gave us a version that felt like a video game dream come to life, instead of a nightmare. It's one of those Hollywood crossroads moments. If Cameron had taken the job, he might not have made Aliens when he did. That means sci-fi history as we know it could look very different, all because of a single directorial choice. What makes this detail even more fun to think about is that Cameron loved experimenting with technology, and The Last Starfighter was the perfect playground. It was one of the first movies to use heavy CGI instead of model ships. That kind of challenge would have been right up his alley. Yet, somehow, he missed it, and Castle became the man to gamble on pixels instead of plastic models. The CGI gamble that changed cinema. Back in 1984, most special effects were still being done with miniatures, matte paintings, or stop motion. At the time, computers were clunky machines locked away in labs and not something you turn to for blockbuster visuals. That's why The Last Starfighter was such a bold leap, because it became one of the very first movies to use computer-generated imagery to create its entire space world. The producers ditched traditional models and handed the big space battles over to a small company called Digital Productions. At the time, this was unheard of. No one had ever used CGI on this scale before. Studios thought it was too risky, expensive, and too unproven. But the filmmakers saw a chance to make the movie stand out, and they gambled everything on it. It wasn't smooth sailing, though. The computers used to render the Gunstar ships and alien armadas. They were massive Cray supercomputers, which were machines that cost millions and filled entire rooms. Even then, every frame took hours to render. For perspective, today your phone can outprocess those giants. But in 1984, this was cutting edge. The audience was blown away. Sure, by today's standards, the graphics looked dated and blocky, but at the time, they were unlike anything people had ever seen. Spaceships weren't just plastic models hanging on strings, but they looked like they were made of metal, reflecting light, soaring through vast digital star fields. For a kid in the theater, it was jaw-dropping. That gamble paid off in the long run, too. The movie proved CGI wasn't just a gimmick. It showed Hollywood that digital effects could actually replace, traditional methods. That same lesson paved the way for Tron, Terminator 2, Jurassic Park, and eventually the CGI-dominated blockbusters we get today. So, while The Last Starfighter didn't make Star Wars money, it left behind something arguably bigger, and is a legacy as one of the pioneers of computer effects. It showed that even if the story was simple, the technology could open doors to whole new worlds. Robert Preston's final bow. One of the strangest facts about The Last Starfighter has nothing to do with spaceships or video games. It has to do with the man who played Centauri, the smooth-talking alien who recruits Alex. His name was Robert Preston. Preston wasn't new to acting. In fact, he had been a star for decades. Older fans knew him best from The Music Man, a hit musical where he played another fast-talking character. Casting him as Centauri made sense. He knew how to talk quickly, smile big, and pull people in with charm. That's exactly what the movie needed. What makes this role unusual is that it turned out to be his last movie. After The Last Starfighter, Robert Preston never appeared in another film. He did some work on television, but this was the final time he lit up the big screen. That gives Centauri a special kind of weight, and we see that every grin, fast deal, and sly joke were all part of Preston's last performance in a movie. When you watch him on screen, you can feel how much life he gave the character. Centauri could have been just another silly sidekick. Instead, Preston made him fun, sharp, and unforgettable. He made sure the audience cared about him, even in a movie filled with new computer effects. Preston passed away only a few years later, in 1987. Fans who grew up with him in musicals went back to The Last Starfighter and realized this was where it all ended. And all of a sudden, the movie became more than a cult sci-fi hit and became the place where a Hollywood legend said goodbye. Dark, deleted scene. Movies often hide their strangest secrets not in what we see on screen, but in what gets cut out. The Last Starfighter is no exception. Buried in its production history is a deleted scene that almost took the movie in a much darker direction than anyone expected from a light-hearted space adventure. In this missing moment, Louis, Alex's little brother, was meant to stumble onto Centauri's car after Alex had already left Earth. If you remember, Centauri's shiny DeLorean-style vehicle could hide in plain sight, looking like an ordinary ride. But this scene had Louis snooping around, crawling inside, and discovering the strange alien tech left behind. What he found wasn't just blinking lights and cool gadgets. He also got a glimpse of something disturbing, recordings that hinted at the violence and destruction the Star League was caught up in. The idea was to give audiences a taste of the real danger Alex was facing out in space. It would have changed the movie's tone, reminding us that, yes, this was fun and adventurous, but there were also serious stakes. For Louis, the scene would have added a moment of foreshadowing, suggesting that his brother was in the middle of a war that could very well cost him his life. So why was it cut? According to those who worked on the film, the scene slowed the pacing and felt too grim for the overall mood. The movie was aiming for thrills and wonder, not heavy dread. Plus, giving Louis too much knowledge would have disrupted the balance of the story because he needed to stay the innocent little brother cheering Alex on from the sidelines. The arcade game that never was. One of the weirdest and possibly funnest things about The Last Starfighter is that it feels like the perfect setup for a real arcade game. The story is about a kid who masters a video machine in a trailer park, only to find out it's a test, so you'd think the studio would cash in and release the actual game. Believe it or not, that was the plan. Atari, which was huge in the early 80s, started working on a real Last Starfighter arcade cabinet while the movie was being made. They wanted players to sit down at a machine that looked just like the one Alex played in the film. It was supposed to feature space battles, Gunstar ships, and alien armadas, all powered by Atari's new 3D graphics system. This would have been cutting edge at the time because most games still used flat, blocky designs. The weird part is that the game was basically finished, but it never came out. Atari ran into money problems in the mid-80s and pulled the plug before the game could hit arcades. Some say the company worried the graphics were too advanced for the average player, and others believe the crash of the video game market in 1983 scared them off. Whatever the reason, the cabinets were shelved. For years, the game became almost a myth. Fans whispered about it, but hardly anyone had seen it. A few prototypes existed, and tiny bits of footage leaked, showing what the gameplay might have looked like. But most people only knew the story, that somewhere out there, Atari had built the real Starfighter machine, then locked it away. Beta units expanded role. If you've seen The Last Starfighter, you'll remember Beta Unit. He's the robot double who takes Alex's place on Earth, while the real Alex is off in space fighting the Kodan Armada. Beta looks like Alex, talks like Alex, but he's awkward and doesn't always get human behavior right. In the finished movie, he's mostly there for comic relief, tossing in a few laughs while the real story happens among the stars. But the thing is, Beta was supposed to have a much bigger role. Early drafts of the script gave him more screen time and deeper storylines. He was supposed to be more than a stand-in, and be a full character with his own struggles and development. In fact, the filmmakers originally saw him as an important second lead. In one scrapped idea, Beta would have struggled with what it meant to be human. He would have asked questions about identity, feelings, and whether he was more than just a machine. There were also scenes where Beta faced serious danger. One version of the script had him attacked by alien assassins who tracked him to Earth. Instead of just hiding and joking around, Beta would have had a tense showdown that gave him more weight in the story. This would have balanced the Earth scenes with the space scenes, giving the audience two big plots running side by side. But a lot of this material never made it past the editing room. Test audiences reportedly didn't respond well to the longer Beta sections, and the studio felt it slowed the pacing. The choice was made to trim Beta down into more of a side gag. What we got was a handful of funny moments, like his trouble pretending to be Alex around Maggie, instead of a full-on exploration of a robot trying to live as a human. Fans who've heard about the cut material often wonder what the movie would feel like if Beta had kept his bigger role. Would The Last Starfighter have turned into a more thoughtful story about identity and belonging? Or would it have lost the fast, adventurous feel that made it fun in the first place? Ron Cobb's Gunstar. Many who watched the movie vividly remember Gunstar. That heavy-looking starship Alex takes into battle wasn't just tossed into the movie. It came from the mind of Ron Cobb, one of the most trusted artists in Hollywood sci-fi at the time. Cobb had already been working in movies for years. He helped design aliens in Star Wars, added the industrial look of the ship in Alien, and he even worked on Conan the Barbarian, and later on, Back to the Future. By the time The Last Starfighter came around, Cobb knew how to make things look like they belonged on the big screen. For the Gunstar, Cobb wanted something that looked strong and reliable, not flimsy or cartoony. He sketched out several versions before landing on the one audience know today. The ship looks like it could actually survive a war. It has thick wings, big engines, and a body that feels tough. Fans often point out that it doesn't look like a sleek sports car in space. It looks more like a serious fighter jet built for battle, which gave it an edge. Unlike the ships in Star Wars, which were built as miniatures, the Gunstar lived entirely inside a computer. Once Cobb finished the drawings, the designs had to be turned into digital models. Back then, this was brand new territory. Most designers could walk into a workshop and hold a physical model in their hands. With the Gunstar, Cobb had to trust that his work would come alive on giant machines full of wires and processors. And it did. The Gunstar became one of the first starships ever seen entirely through computer graphics. For audiences in 1984, this was jaw-dropping. You weren't watching a plastic toy fly past a black background. You were literally watching something that looked like it belonged in a new kind of video game. Kids came out of theaters talking about how real it looked, even if the computers rendering it almost broke down during the process. Looking back, the Gunstar is one of the reasons the film is still remembered. Ron Cobb gave the movie a star vehicle, in every sense, and without it, the film might not have lasted in fans' memories. Cult classic on VHS. When the movie first came out in theaters in 1984, it didn't make much money. Audiences were still chasing the big shadows of Star Wars, and the movie slipped past a lot of people. But then something strange happened once it hit VHS. Slowly, through rental stores and home collections, the film found new life. Back then, renting a movie was such an event. Families would pile into the car, walk through aisles of plastic cases, and pick something out for the weekend. The Last Starfighter became one of those tapes that kids begged to take home. The cover alone, which showed Alex holding the helmet with the stars behind him, looked like an adventure waiting to happen. Even if someone had missed it in theaters, the VHS made it easy to discover. Word of mouth spread the fame even further. Kids who loved video games connected with the story right away. They saw themselves in Alex, the small-town teenager who proved his skills on an arcade machine. For them, the idea that playing games could lead to something bigger felt like a secret dream. Over time, the movie turned into one of those "you have to see this" rentals that got passed around between friends. VHS also gave fans the chance to rewatch the film as many times as they wanted. Unlike theaters, where you saw it once or twice, tapes could be played until the ribbon wore thin. Fans memorized the lines, studied the ships, and rewound the Death Blossom scene again and again. Another big boost came from cable television. Channels in the late 80s and early 90s often filled their schedules with movies that didn't break the box office, but still had a loyal audience. The Last Starfighter became one of those regular features. Combined with the growing VHS market, it reached far more people than its original run ever did. By the time DVDs came around, the movie had already secured its place as a cult classic. The fans the movie raised were the kind who would hunt down special editions, trivia, and behind-the-scenes stories. That loyalty all started with the VHS era, where the movie transformed from a box office release into a beloved favorite. Tron's digital DNA. Before The Last Starfighter ever hit theaters, Disney had already tested the waters with a strange movie called Tron. Released in 1982, Tron was filled with glowing light cycles and computer grids, and it showed Hollywood what digital effects could look like. At the time, critics weren't sure what to make of it. Some people thought it was ahead of its time, and others thought it was too weird to ever catch on. But the thing is, a lot of the people who worked on Tron carried their experience straight into The Last Starfighter. Special effects artists, designers, and computer wizards who had experimented on Tron now brought their skills to this new project. You can almost see the connection. Where Tron had neon highways, The Last Starfighter had glowing starships and swirling battles. Both movies looked less like traditional sci-fi and more like arcade games brought to life. Even the way Rylos, the alien world, was built owes something to Tron. Some unused concept art from other sci-fi projects got pulled in, but the overall feel was familiar. Sleek, shiny, and almost too clean. At the time, most sci-fi leaned toward the dirty, lived-in look of Star Wars. Ships were scratched, planets looked rough, and aliens lived in messy, crowded places. The Last Starfighter went the other way and had a glossy feel, like the whole thing might exist inside an arcade cabinet. Fans today often joke that The Last Starfighter looks like Tron's cousin. It didn't try to copy Star Wars, but leaned into that digital dream world style, which made it stand out. Some people loved it, and some thought it looked strange. But weird or not, it gave the movie its own personality. The artists behind the film didn't know if audiences were ready for this much computer imagery. They were basically testing the limits of what could be done. The spaceships, the explosions, even the Death Blossom attack, all showed off lessons learned from Tron. Without that earlier film breaking ground, The Last Starfighter might never have had the confidence to dive fully into CGI. What's the weirdest part of The Last Starfighter history for you? Do you think this movie deserves more credit for what it tried? And should cult classics like this ever be remade or left as they are? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.